I'm David Starkey, and today I'm going to talk about a very strange subject indeed, a royal revolution. That's to say, the royal revolution in Britain, the British Empire, which took place largely in 1917 and led to the foundation of the House of Windsor. Now, the idea of a royal revolution is a paradox, isn't it? Revolutions typically are very anti-royal and often cut kings' heads off. This one didn't. Arguably, it saved the king's head and possibly even the British monarchy. Indeed, it may very well be a fundamental reason that it's still with us. But the idea of a royal revolution in 1917, we multiply the strangenesses. Strangest of all is the person who carried it out. The king, or rather, to give him his proper title, because he was also Emperor of India, the King Emperor, King George V. Now, a less likely revolutionary you couldn't possibly imagine. George V was an upstanding, straightforward, decent, profoundly anti-revolutionary, profoundly conservative man. He was happily, or at least he was faithfully married, and led the most blameless married life of any British sovereign since at least George III. And then there were his personal habits. They were profoundly, I can multiply the idea, they were profoundly habitual. He was devoted to routine, particularly the routines of his weather gauge, which he took daily and carefully noted down the results, and to his stamp collection, philately, the most boring of hobbies. Anyway, water gauge, stamp collecting, and dutifully keeping a diary, which tells us all about his life, and indeed, just glancing at it tells you a lot about himself. It's written, not as you might imagine for a royal diary, in wonderful paper and perfect, elaborate handwriting. No, it's written on a kind of school textbook, school exercise book rather, lined paper, in a very round, not very well developed, almost schoolboy hand. And yet, this deeply conservative king, who was similarly conservative in dress, always immaculately dressed, but hated modern fashions, hated turn-ups, hated trousers pressed with a crease, no modernity, loathed the telephone, yet a revolutionary. One of the strangest things about him is the fact that he actually liked his father. This is unusual in the House of Hanover, or indeed what becomes the House of Windsor. Think of Prince Charles's awkward, sometimes tempestuous, sometimes demeaning relations with the late Prince Philip. That's typical, in fact it's rather mild compared with the typical father-son tensions, father, especially eldest son, tensions within the royal house. George V didn't have a bit of it. He was devoted to the memory of his father, Edward VII. And this led to the first very important development in the monarchy when he succeeds Edward VII after Edward's brief reign of only 9 years in 1910. He didn't change what his father had done. Edward VII, very, very different from George V. He is the pleasure boy king, Tom, as he was called behind his back, but never to his face, gross in appetites, gross in his eating and drinking, and of course particularly gross in his womanizing. There was a box at his coronation which was filled with his mistresses, past, present, and indeed perhaps future, and it was known as the loose box. Now, this man was easy in public, easy going in public. He was a natural and fluent and extempore public speaker. He loved ceremony. He loved splendour. And the monarchy undergoes a bit of a revolution under Edward VII too. His mother, Victoria, surprisingly, and not what we think of the Victorians at all, didn't actually much like ceremony. And indeed, particularly after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, withdrew for long periods of time from public life entirely, gives up things like the state opening of Parliament, is only at the very end of her reign again, is at all frequently visible in public, and even then keeps it low-key, relatively low-key. Edward VII sweeps all that away. He begins, at least plans, a magnificent coronation. The fact that he developed severe abdominal problems with his appendix, which he very nearly died from, actually forced both the postponement of the coronation and its toning down. But otherwise there is this renewed appetite for ceremony, for splendour. George V keeps that, but it changes. First of all, well, there's a coronation. What George does is to fulfil to the letter his father's intentions for the coronation, which, because of his state of health and the delays, he hadn't actually been able to carry out himself. So in the coronation of George V is undoubtedly the most magnificent, probably since the 17th century, arguably even earlier, and is musically splendid too. Why? What's going on? A quick glance back to the coronation of Victoria. The coronation of Victoria is one of the most shambolic events in English history. I'll explore it more fully on another occasion, but just to give you the odd flavours of it, the Archbishop of Canterbury forgot his spectacles and stumbled repeatedly through the service. The ring was the wrong size and unfortunately was too small and was forced onto Victoria's finger, and one of the barons performing homage constantly slipped and fell down the steps. This, remember, is still really the Regency, to raucous applause. It's a preposterous occasion. Not a bit of it at the beginning of the 20th century. Suddenly, ceremony changes. It becomes disciplined, organised, carefully rehearsed. Why? Because the king and the upper classes are aware, really I think for the first time, that they've got another audience. First time, probably since the Tudors, that there's another audience. That thing called the people. When, back in 1837 with Victoria, you're performing a coronation in what is still an essentially aristocratic culture, well, everybody knows about ceremony, but there's no great need to take it very seriously. It takes me back to my days at Cambridge. Of course, lots of academic ceremony, but there was a sense it always ought to be a little bit shambolic, gowns off one shoulder, gowns hung and green and torn and moth-eaten. It was casual. It's just a thing that you do amongst yourselves. Not at the beginning of the 20th century, because Britain is about 3/4 of the way to becoming a real democracy. There's an audience. It's the people. They want a good show. They're used, of course, to a good show. Huge popular theatres with proper lighting, the introduction of electricity, of magnificent stage shows and performances. The monarchy has got to perform. So, George V performs. But he hates it. Whereas his father had enjoyed it, he loathes it. But he still goes through with it. It's the same again with the state opening of Parliament. George V, again following in his father's footsteps, determines that he too will open Parliament in person. But of course, there's a double problem. The first is he's got to give a speech, read one, Edward VII found that easy, and indeed on his first opening of Parliament started to correct the speech because he didn't think it was very well written, until he's quickly informed by the Prime Minister that the words are the words of his ministers, even though they are uttered by the monarch himself. George V, though, is paralysed. He describes the state opening and having to give the speech as the most painful experience of his life, and here's a man who had been a midshipman in the Royal Navy. So there's this personal agony, but there's another agony, which is not a mental agony, it's an actual physical agony. He finds the crown, not the massive St Edward crown, which the thing that's remade, of course, at the time of the Restoration, following the destruction, the complete medieval and Tudor regalia by the Puritan rebels in the middle of the 17th century. The so-called St Edward crown, that massive crown, is used for the coronation, again for the first time since the 17th century. But the crown that's used for the state opening of Parliament is the imperial state crown. It's now got the magnificent South African Cullinan diamond in the front of it, again inserted under Edward VII. And unfortunately, that crown, which had been made originally for Victoria, well, it doesn't fit George V at all. He's got a long, thin skull, and it gives him the most terrible migraines. But he continues to wear it, and bizarrely, he took the decision himself. He formally consulted the Liberal cabinet. Did they think it appropriate and necessary that he should wear the crown? Because even his father hadn't bothered with the crown. He'd only worn an admiral's tricorn hat. George thinks he should wear the crown. We have the private correspondence of cabinet ministers who make perfectly clear that they couldn't have cared less what the king wore, and in many ways would have much preferred that there wasn't a state opening at all. But he perseveres. Now, what is this attitude to ceremony? You don't like it. You're uncomfortable in doing it. You're physically uncomfortable in what you've got to wear. This is ceremony, not as it had been with an Edward VII, not as it had been, say, with a Henry VIII, somebody who is naturally expansive, enjoys publicity, has star quality and flair. Poor George V had none of those things. Instead, this is ceremony as duty, a kind of magnificent gold lace hair shirt which the monarch has to wear because he feels he should. And this notion of duty, this golden wheel to which the monarch is bound, from that point onwards becomes, I think, central to the whole British monarchy. And of course supplies the dynamo which drives our present Queen, who very consciously follows not only in the footsteps of her father, George VI, but of her grandfather, this man, George V. So ceremony. The other thing that's remarkable about the beginning of George's reign is that he faces a huge political crisis. I've already mentioned the idea of democracy and that Britain is about 3/4 of the way to becoming a real one. Virtually all men have the vote, but no women yet do at this point. They will only acquire that after the First World War. But of course, the shift from the aristocratic politics or the middle-class politics of Victoria's reign to a democratic politics is profoundly difficult, and there are major tensions, between the classes, particularly over subjects like taxation. And the return of a radical Liberal government in 1906 committed to a very significant, I was going to say extension of the welfare state, really the creation of the centrally funded welfare state with the consequent need for heavily increased taxation, triggers a long drawn out political crisis between it has a constitutional expression between the House of Commons, where the Liberals have an overwhelming majority, and the House of Lords, which still has a Tory majority, which is passionately opposed to the expansion of the state, and particularly opposed to being hit in the pocket by increased taxation to pay for it. And it's left to poor George V to have to preside over the resolution of this crisis. And it takes the form of the Parliament Act of 1911, which destroys the independent legislative status of the House of Lords and compels the House of Lords eventually to back down if the House of Commons decides to do something. And George is brutally browbeaten on this, browbeaten by the Prime Minister Asquith, browbeaten by his own private secretary, Lord Knowles. He never forgives them. He was inexperienced. He never forgives them, but probably it was for the best, because it meant that the monarchy could survive even though the political power of the aristocracy begins its long, vertiginous decline. So, a monarchy that is quasi-democratic in the performance of public ritual, consciously appealing to an appetite, a popular appetite for show, for ceremony. A monarchy that has espoused a major step towards democracy, the reduction of the power of the aristocracy, amongst whom, of course, the king, the members of the royal family, moved at ease and spent their time and socialised with them and regarded them as quasi-equals. Then finally, there's another major ceremonial shift at the beginning of George's reign, and it takes the form of building. So often building takes us into the heart of political change. Well, Victoria, the great Queen Empress, had died. That's George's grandmother, and there was a decision that there should be a great national monument to Victoria, and subscriptions came in and rolled in, and it took the form of course, a statue, that great statue surmounting a fountain, which stands in the front of Buckingham Palace. But the man in charge of the project, an extraordinary figure, I will be talking a lot about him on other occasions, an extraordinary man called Reginald Brett, Viscount Esher. He's in charge of this great project to commemorate Victoria. And he's one of those who had been most behind these adaptations, these ceremonial adaptations to democracy, the realisation, bread and circuses, that the people not only want a welfare state, they want a good show from their rulers as well. And he captures the idea of the monument to Victoria, and he turns it instead into a re-engineering and reimagining of the whole ceremonial heart of London. He rebuilds, replans, completely transforms architecturally and in terms of its tree planting that magnificent avenue at the front of Buckingham Palace, the Mall. It's turned into a grand ceremonial avenue. You begin with Admiralty Arch that links this to Trafalgar Square, and then sweep straight up to the front of Buckingham Palace, and what do? You create an enormous roundabout, elevated at the end of the Mall, a bit like the front of St. Peter's, that great horseshoe space. What's the front of St. Peter's for, surrounded by the Bernini Piazza? It's so that the Pope on his balcony can greet the faithful. Esher had exactly the same idea. You create that vast roundabout in front of Buckingham Palace so that the monarch can greet his people. You even, when they finally, because there's a bit of money left over, you stick a new front. It's only a bit of stone thick on the front of Buckingham Palace, which up to that point had looked a bit like a terrace in Kensington. You stick a new splendid stone front on, and just like the front of St. Peter's, there's a balcony in the centre, and there the monarch can greet his people at the culmination of these great popular ceremonies. So you've altered royal ceremony, and with the alterations to the front of Buckingham Palace, you've created a theatre for ceremony. All of this is George V's adaptation of what he'd largely inherited from his father, Edward VII. The other thing, I suppose, that he'd inherited from his father, Edward VII, was Britain's involvement in European alliances, particularly the Entente Cordiale with France, which had been very much pioneered by Edward VII, who is a deep Francophile. And that, of course, drags Britain into the horrors of the First World War. And it's the First World War which is the background to that royal revolution. Of course, all the other European monarchies at the end of the First World War find themselves subject, not all of them, all the great ones, the imperial monarchies, like Britain, the imperial monarchy of Russia, the Tsar, the imperial monarchy of Germany, the Kaiser, the imperial monarchy of Austria-Hungary. They all find themselves beset by real revolution and overthrown. Britain doesn't. Britain triumphs. And so much of that triumph, well, it's partly due to the fact that Britain wins in the First World War rather than is defeated. It's always better to be on the winning side than the losing one. But it's also due to the fact that real revolution is headed off by royal revolution, by this least likely revolutionary, by George V. Of course, events take him by surprise. It's 1917, the year of revolutions, the year in particular of the two revolutions in Russia. Now, Russia was Britain's ally in the First World War. Much more importantly, in George V's perspective, the Tsar, Nicholas, was George's first cousin through the royal house of Denmark. And when you look at them, they look more like brothers than mere cousins. Identical beards, identical stances, very, very similar features. And they were very close. The Tsar speaks and writes fluent English. They're in frequent correspondence. So, when the Tsar is overthrown in the spring of 1917, George is appalled. We have that diary, that schoolboy diary. We can see him following events in Russia with horror. But he's not just upset. Let's be blunt. He's frightened, because there are too many signs that Britain might be teetering on the edge of something similar. I've already talked about the movement to democracy. All of that, of course, is powerfully aided by the gigantic forces of the First World War, the mass mobilization, the involvement of women, and so on. Moreover, there are uncomfortable signs, and the war hadn't been going very well. There were huge casualties. There were mutinies in the fleet, and there were stirrings even in England. The stirrings were often of intellectuals. The novelist and Fabian socialist H.G. Wells, immediately after that first Russian Revolution, publishes a letter in the Times calling for a republican society in Britain. Not revolution, you get it, but a republican society. And he'd already, in one of his novels, denounced George V as a dull and alien court. George is deeply indignant. He may be dull, he said, but he was damned if he was alien, because George, although his blood is entirely German, with a dash of Danish as well, although his blood is German. He is the first king, probably since before the Norman conquest, who only really spoke English. He saw himself as being authentically English, so he's very offended by this denunciation of him as being alien. But the trouble is, of course, it touched a nerve, because he really was alien. The royal house was German. Now, of course, it had been in Britain since it had been in Britain at that point for almost exactly 200 years. And 200 years, for heaven's sake, is plenty of time for people to assimilate. But there was a problem. The marriage rules of the royal house, the German royal house, required, that's the English-German royal house, the House of Hanover, required that they had to marry back in Germany. They couldn't marry English men and English women. They couldn't, in other words, assimilate. So with each generation of the royal family, you re-Germanize again. It's like some immigrant groups in Britain now who continue to marry their cousins from the subcontinent, which means that each generation remains foreign. And that's exactly what had happened with the German royal house, the German English, the Anglo-German royal house. George recognises the problem. We are fighting, Britain is fighting an all-out total war against Germany. But he's German. Still worse, the German Tsar, still worse, the German Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, is his own first cousin. The degree of that intimacy of relationship. The Kaiser's mother is Victoria's elder daughter, and George V's father is Victoria's eldest son. The relationship is as close as that. So George decides, those famous words, something must be done. And for this conservative man, he's astonishingly radical. He decides nothing less than the house, the royal house, has to cease to be German. It has to become English. It has to change its name, and it has to change its royal customs. And immediately the quest begins. Well, first of all, what was he called already? Nobody was actually terribly sure. Was it Guelph? Was it Saxe-Coburg-Gotha? What was it? Anyway, so there's first of all a quest to discover what he's called, but then the much more important and much more difficult quest, what should he be called? Should they go back? Should they look back to the past, to Plantagenet, to Tudor, to Stuart? All of these options are tried. And what's very interesting is the quality of the people who are involved. There's the King's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, John Bigg, who is very solid, highly intelligent man. There are then former prime ministers like Lord Rosebery, like Asquith, who by this time had been overthrown by Lloyd George, like A.J. Balfour, the former Conservative Prime Minister. They're all consulted. The King himself, of course, is at the centre of the debate. And all of these ideas are tossed around and debated, and nobody likes any of them. And the pressure is further and further put on as you get more and more into May and June. And Bigg is writing in states of agony, particularly to Rosebery, with whom he was on very confidential terms. This is a disaster, he says. The King demands a name, and we haven't got one. And then suddenly, it's Stamfordham, it's Bigg, it's the private secretary who comes up with it. He has a stroke of inspiration. Why not call the royal house Windsor? Immediately, everyone recognises it's a stroke of genius. It's a touch of Shakespeare, The Merry Wives. It's, I suppose, the Garter. Windsor is the seat of the Order of the Garter at the St George's Chapel. It's, if you want to be a little bit frivolous, it's woods of Windsor and nice smells, soft soap, history, pageantry, legend, England. It's perfect. The choice is made. It's announced. It's declared to the Privy Council. The press reacts highly favourably. But it's not just the king himself. You thoroughly de-Germanise the whole royal family, its peripheral members, like the House of Teck or the Battenbergs. They're all hastily retreaded, and the Battenbergs become Mountbatten. They're all given appropriate English titles. So the royal family becomes ostentatiously English. But at the same time, you do something else. And George V really was very thorough about it. It seems that he recognised what it was that had kept the royal family foreign, that had kept it essentially German, which were the marriage customs. So, at the same meeting of the Privy Council, in which he formally declares his intention to rename the royal house, he does something else. He declares, this time in the name of himself and his wife, Queen Mary, she of the bolt upright and the choker necklaces and the toque hat, he always called her May. He declares that May and I decided that our children, listen, would be able to marry English men and English women. You change at a stroke, not simply the name of the royal house, you change its marriage customs, which will, of course, if the princes and princesses of the royal house go on and marry English people, they will actually become really English, that process of assimilation which has happened so quickly and so rapidly following 1917 and the change of the marriage customs. Now, that in itself would have been pretty remarkable, but it's not the end of what happens in that summer of 1917. You've deliberately nationalised the monarchy. You've turned it from a German dynasty into an English family. You have given it, if you like, back to the people. You've consciously made it a popular national possession, if you like, a great British family. And that idea of a family monarchy is something, again, that I will explore much more fully. But you do something that parallels this. You alter fundamentally the way in which the monarchy honours and regards the British citizen. Up to this point, of course, we all know monarchs and honours, we think of the investitures now, are absolutely central to the relationship between the monarch and its leading subjects, its leading citizens, the way in which people are honoured, who is honoured, how they are honoured. Up to this point, of course, there was, a very elaborate honour system going right back to the Middle Ages. I've already mentioned the Order of the Garter, which was based in St George's Chapel at Windsor. That's the most ancient and the most important order of chivalry, with just 24 knights. After that, there's the Order of the Bath, and then which is based in Westminster Abbey, and then you multiply other orders. So at the beginning of the 19th century, there's the Michael and the George. There's also the Order of St Patrick in Ireland, because Ireland is still part, the whole of Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom, and there is the Order of the Thistle in Scotland. So this complex of orders, but they're all numerically very small, and they're intended only for the aristocratic elite. But you suddenly what? You've nationalised the monarchy. You've democratised it. You have embraced the House of Commons as against the House of Lords with the Parliament Act. You've created new forms of ceremony which are consciously designed to appeal to the people. And yet you're left with this very, very narrow system of honours. Not for much longer, because in that same summer of 1917, you revolutionise the honours system itself, and you create two new orders. One of them, I'm quite familiar with it actually, because I have a bit of it, the order of the British Empire, the much fraught in today's world order of the British Empire, now seen by some on the left as a wicked symbol of imperialism. It is created at the time quite deliberately as a mass democratic order to recognise, first of all, the services of the multitudinous troops who have fought in the war, and also those on the home front who've been involved as well. So this is an order which is designed not for the few, but for the many. This is, if you like, a real new labour order. And actually, there's a lot of labour in it as well. Old labour, we'll come to that in a moment. It's a new labour order designed for the many, not for the few, for hundreds and for thousands. System of ranks, of course, beginning at the top with Knights Grand Commander and going right down at the bottom to the British Empire Medal. Right? You've created a new order. You need, don't you? You need an investiture. You need an investiture at which you're going to inaugurate this crucially important new order. Where's it going to take place? Well, I remember vividly the moment in which I was invested with the CBE, the commander of the British Empire, by the Queen in the ballroom at Buckingham Palace. That's typically where they take place. Not in 1917. The inaugural investiture of the Order of the British Empire took place not in London, but about as far away in terms of both geography and, if you like, ideology as you can be. It took place in Glasgow. It didn't take place in the magnificent City Hall of Glasgow. No. It took place again, somewhere as remote as you can possibly think of from the gilded splendours of the ballroom at Buckingham Palace. It took place in Ibrox Park Football Stadium, in front of a crowd perhaps of 100,000. I would argue it's actually, even now, over 100 years later, it is the most overtly, dramatically, theatrically democratic event in the entire history of the British monarchy. The King wears not robes, but khaki, like a First World War general. He enters in an armoured car and is driven round the perimeter of the pitch to receive the vast applause of the crowd. And the star of the show isn't the people getting the Knight's Grand Cross, isn't the dignitaries and the generals and the admirals and the politician. No. The star of the show is a woman called Miss Lizzie Robertson. She is the recipient of the humblest grade of the Order of the British Empire, the British Empire Medal. And what did she get it for? She got it for being an unusually effective munitions worker, because Glasgow, the great industries of Glasgow, shipbuilding and everything else, were turned over to the war effort. And she turns up, how? In her work overalls. But of course, this is effectively still Edwardian England. Women wore very tight belts to their dresses, with a great deal coming up there, and Miss Robertson was a pert young lady, and the Order of the British Empire Medal had to be pinned to the bosom, and it was noted that King George V, without Queen Mary, took rather a long time to attach the medal to Miss Robertson's pert bosom. the vast applause of the crowd. So that's, this is an order of ceremony by the sun in its old days. But it wasn't simply that sort of populism. There was also something else, the populism of sentiment. The king also conferred some VCs, and one was carried in, broken man, possibly even dying, on a stretcher. And again, the force, the emotion of the crowd. That was the order of the British Empire. But the innovation didn't stop there. You created another order as well. It was called the Companions of Honour. Now, this was something very different. The order of the British Empire, it's just like any one of the other orders. As I said, there are the grades, the various forms of knighthood, commander, the Order of the British Empire, the Member of the British Empire, the BEM, the British Empire Medal. The Companions of Honour, it's different. It's much more like, well, what is it like? Companions of Honour, does it trigger a little memory? The Légion d'Honneur, the Legion of Honour, the similarly mass order of chivalry, though Republican chivalry, which is created by Napoleon and still continues to be awarded in France. And the Companion of Honour was that. And it was designed deliberately, believe it or not, for Labour politicians and trade unionists in 1917. The monarchy and its advisers had already anticipated the coming to power of organised labour and of the political representatives of organised labour. And you know what? They were determined to incorporate them. They were determined to treat them, well, what? Like the grit in the oyster, which has layer and layer of pearl put on it until the little bit of grit turns into a nice royalist pearl. Well, that was the purpose of the Companions of Honour. But they did get one thing wrong. They thought that the Labour trade unionists, that the members of the Labour Party itself, because of course they denounced wealth and privilege and aristocracy so loudly, they thought they wouldn't be interested in titles. Such frippery, how could they possibly be? So Companions of Honour carried no distinguishing form of address. There was simply the badge and simply the initial CH behind your name. And the original holders of it were exactly what was intended, leading trade unionists and both local and national Labour politicians. But, you know what? They got it a bit wrong. Labour politicians and trade unionists turned out to be just as keen on titles as everybody else, which slightly marooned the Companions of Honour. But that was the only slight blemish in this extraordinary process of reconstruction, reimagining and reconception of the British monarchy. A royal revolution that arguably headed off real revolution and turned this most conventional of British kings into one of the, well, I would argue, the most important. He's substantially forgotten, but if you want a guide to why, insofar as she has been effective, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has been effective, it's that she's walked, as she promised at the beginning of her reign, in the footsteps of that deeply conventional man with a certain populist feel, her grandfather, George V.